And welcome back, students. As we continue our discussion on loops, we've already have discussed the while and the do while loop, but now we're going to get to that third loop that Java likes to use, which is that of the for loop. So getting started, all right, recall that we've been able to use repetitive tasks and simplify them using things like while and do while loops. There's another type of loop, as I've already mentioned, which is called the for loop. The for loop is used a lot of times when we want to increment a loop and we generally know how many iterations of loop we're going to be going through. Not always the case, but a lot of times this is where you'll see a for loop get implemented. So here's a quick sample code. Int sum equals 0, next. For next equals 0, next is less than or equal to 10, next plus plus. Sum equals sum plus next. System.println sum up to next is sum. So let's look at that for loop and actually kind of pull it apart a little bit. So here's the first part of it, the header of the loop. There are 3 parts inside of a for loop. Each of these parts are separated by a semicolon. The first part is the initialization. This takes whatever the variables are needed to be initialized and gives them a starting value. You'll note that counting the above example will only need to be 0 once, the very first time. After that first iteration through the loop, it's going to increment. Hence, where we have count plus plus. All right, so it goes 0, goes through the stuff in the middle, comes back up. Oh, count plus plus, it's now 1. Same thing before. It's going to go through, increment, now it'll be 2, so on and so forth. The second part of the loop is our Boolean expression. This acts as a check for how long do you want the loop to run. In this example that we're looking at here, once the count hits 10, it's going to follow the loop. Now, the third part is the update. This increments or decrements the variable in the Boolean expression. You'll note that the increment-decrement occurs only after the code inside your loop has been processed. So it has to do whatever statements you have inside of here first before it does the plus plus. Now, the variable used in the for loop can, of course, technically be declared either inside or outside the for loop. So you could have like for int I equals 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus. Or you could say I int of I for I equals 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus. Now, when constructing our for loops, for now, declare your variable outside of your for loop. And the reason why you want to do that is it gives you some accessibility. Because if you put it inside your for loop, you might have some trouble accessing different variables. But it's perfectly acceptable to use either one. But just when we're starting out today, we're going to go ahead and start it off so that way it's outside the loop. Once you've done a couple of labs like that, you're more than welcome to switch to using this way. A lot of times I'll use it this way because a lot of times I'm only interested in a variable that is going to be locally existing inside of this loop. Now, additionally, while you can use any variable for your loop, it could be count, I, int, whatever, you should kind of use something that makes more sense for your naming convention, such as count. Or you can use the convention even of I as your variable, or sometimes you'll see J as well, especially if you nest loops. All right, so the semantics of the for loop. Let's break this down one more time. You start off with initialization. All right, so you initialize I to 0. Then you have some kind of Boolean expression. All right, so is I at this point less than 0? Okay, and well, if I start at 0 and I is less than 0, well, that's false. However, let's say I has to be less than 5. Well, 0 is less than 5, so that's going to be true. And then it's going to, all right, do your body statements and then update. And then from there, it goes back to the Boolean expression and repeats the process all the way until you hit a fault. Now, the interesting thing about loops is that you can convert from one kind of loop to the other. We already looked at how you can do a while to a do while and a do while to a while. But you can also take a for loop and very easily convert it to a while loop. All right, so here's our 2 examples. I have for number equals 100, number is greater than or equal to 0, number minus minus, system.println number plus bottles of pop in the cooler. Then we say while number is greater than or equal to 0, system.println number of bottles in the cooler, number minus minus. You'll notice the big change here is what happens inside here. So like here, for example, is our starting value. Here, the minus minus moves inside. One thing to note with this while loop, you'd have to initialize number outside of the while loop in order for this to work properly. So you'd have to have like int number equals 100. Same thing right here. They have to have like an int number. Now, these two loops accomplish the exact same thing. And which way you want to do this is up to you. Now, we can, of course, use a comma in our for loops as well. So we can technically initialize multiple actions inside a for loop. It's not something that you necessarily see that often, but it can be done. So for term equals 1, sum equals 0, term is less than or equal to 10, term plus plus, sum equals sum plus term. In this loop, term is initialized to 1, and sum is initialized to 0. This will keep the program, or excuse me, not the program, but the variable to be used by the loop, known as the local variable, and its value will then be inaccessible by the rest of the program. Additionally, you cannot declare multiple types if you're using a comma inside of the for loop. So, for example, int term equals 1, sum term equals 0. Term is less than or equal to 10, term plus plus. The following would also be illegal, as sum would still be a double and not an int. Double sum for int term equals 1, sum equals 0. Term is less than or equal to 10, term plus plus. All right, very easy to see this one because up here we said it was a double. Now we're trying to tell the program it's an int. It doesn't like that. All right, if we look at variables and their Boolean expressions, even though we can use a comma separator in a for loop, it is the safest to just declare all variables outside of the for loop. Additionally, while you can only test one Boolean expression, you can test multiple conditions using and or. Now, there is another pitfall to explore here with for loops, and that is that of the extra semicolon. You do not need to place a semicolon at the end of a for loop. I will tell you I've seen this happen quite often. But let's just take a look at the following. For, that should be int, count equals 1, count is less than 10, count plus plus, this is a non-print hello. Now, if you did not notice, there's a semicolon stuck in right here, and you may expect the loop to output hello 10 times. However, by putting a semicolon here instead of a curly bracket, it makes the loop act as though it's empty and will not execute it. Instead, it's going to simply skip to the next line of code. So whatever was after this curly bracket here would then happen. So you don't want to use semicolons in a for loop, ever. All right, kind of the same thing happens with while loops. You always stick with, in my experience, it's better practice just to stick with using curly brackets rather than like a semicolon. All right, and that wraps up the lesson, folks. So hopefully that gives you some good idea of how to use a for loop, and I will see you next time.